Welcome to Silver Lining for Learning, episode 209. This is a host reflect episode in which four of us as hosts, myself, Chris Dede from Harvard, Lydia Cao from the University of Toronto, Yong Zhao from University of Kansas and Melbourne, and Punya Mishra from Arizona State University, are going to reflect on recent shows and also look at what's coming up and have some reflections on where things are going. So, what are your ladies first? So, tell us what you're reflecting on at the moment.
Awesome. I was like, oh, I'm always good at building on other people's idea. To get started is always so difficult, but I will give it a shot. Uh, I think the past six episodes was super diverse, like ranging from like open university, scaling distance education to like effective personalized learning with AI, collaborative learning with AI, and migrant education. And it was such a diversity of episode that we have seen. And my immediate thoughts is like, it's really like just from the episodes and the previous episode we've seen so far, there's really like a focus they're shifting away from just cognitive, seeing learning as cognitive, but incorporating all these affective, socio-emotional, collaborative dimension into learning. So I thought that was a really interesting observation.
Oh, that's actually, sorry, just to jump in, but I think that's actually quite insightful because I was thinking of, like, I was looking at the screen and looking at the past episodes because honestly, so much happens in between that some of these episodes seem like they could have happened a year ago, and then so you sort of literally have to go back and refresh. But I think that connection that you're making to social emotional, I think that emerged both in some of the AI episodes, actually, as well as the ones on migrant education and so on, which where it is, of course, an important theme. So I think that's an interesting insight. I think the other thing, Chris, maybe you can talk a little bit about is those episodes that you did with the National AI Centers, which I think was also, we're going to have one next week and then one coming up later. And I would like to sort of, one of the questions I asked in this, I will want to dig into that a little bit, how people responded to that, which I think is kind of interesting. But I think, yes, the social emotional one, I think that's a good insight into a thread that maybe connects these somewhat divergent and disparate sort of episodes, which I think is the SLL strength, is that we don't have a bucket that we sit in. We are looking at, people doing interesting things in this space of education and learning and technology or whatever, right? So, yeah.
Well, I did spend 3 days this past week at a summit that's sort of a by invitation only. All 27 national AI institutes send personnel. And for a few days, we just talk about the state of AI and its cross-cutting impacts on different sectors of society, because there's agricultural institutes and wellness institutes and the full range of different kinds of ways that AI can influence and affect society. And it's always interesting to hear what people are talking about. But in terms of the five education institutes, it is clear that uh, two of them are focusing really almost exclusively on social emotional and um, cultural context. And I think that's very interesting because for decades, AI was kind of mired in cognitive, and now it's spreading out. And what you call these skills isn't clear. The latest keyword I've heard is durable, that these things that aren't cognitive are durable skills because they span careers, and it's as good a way to think about it as any. The other thing that I would say came out of the meeting is there was nobody that was um, a gee whiz person about AI, because these are people who've been in the field for a while and who are experts. And there were many warnings about guardrails and about different kinds of constraints that it's really important to put on these systems, and about the value of making claims that are actually evidence-based rather than based on trying to drive up the stock price. So it was heartening, but unfortunately, that's not where the center of gravity is in AI. I forget which magazine came out with the top 100 people in AI. I think there was one person in the 100 who I would have identified as a technical expert in AI. And there were celebrities, and there were, heads of startups and hedge fund managers. I mean, you just can't make up how crazy this stuff is.
So, Chris, if I can jump in, sorry, I just want to respond to two things Chris said. So one was a question that I asked both of the AI groups, which is, you have been working in this space for a long time, and suddenly OpenAI releases this creature into the wild and everybody's going crazy about AI. And so at some level, this is like a big boon for you, in a sense, like, oh, now everybody's talking about AI, something we have been really actively studying and working on, and we have ideas. And so that's great because it brings attention to you. Like, and I think I joked in one of the episodes that more people are going to watch this episode and another episode just because those two letters are in our, in the episode title, right? But at the same time, I think there is also this sort of this feeling of, at least I get, of things being out of control in some way, right? That it's being driven so much more by the hype and by what this technology maybe can, should, will be, where I think the researchers are much more sort of circumspect in terms of the predictions they would make, are much more aware of the limitations of this technology, but also feel this immense pressure to somehow incorporate it in the work that they do. Otherwise, this feeling that you're going to get left behind. And I think that's a very interesting tension that all of those people who have been working in this area for decades now suddenly feel. And then of course the Nobel Prize Committee didn't help by giving like 4 people Nobel Prizes in physics and chemistry who are like AI, Hinton and Nemesis or whatever his name is. It's an interesting time if you are a traditional AI researcher, to feel this tug, I think, from two directions, this tension. So anyway, just wanted to give that comment there.
I was just going to mention about the Nobel Prize, but I think Punya, what you are talking about is really what we typically talk, the zeitgeist. Zeitgeist. The spirit of a time, and that whatever paradigm evolves is applied to every other field. Since we used to apply, our brains think like a computer. Remember the information input, information output, and the CPU, central processing unit. Then we had network. Remember, network was a big deal in 1990s, 20s. I think now we have come to the age of artificial intelligence. It is everywhere. But one issue, when we talk about the AI national centers, all those places, I was involved in a meeting recently, and people are talking about how resistant or indifferent to AI among the education practitioners. I don't know, like Chris, Lydia, or Punya, in your institution, how are faculty reacting to that? I remember, Punya, when I went to Michigan State, 1996, and there were faculty come into the office, the dean's office, saying, bringing a rock and something else to say. I'm not going to use email forever. What do you expect me to do? And so that it's actually very interesting. Another thing I've been thinking about is whatever content we prescribe for our students, either K-12 or higher education or postgraduates. And that's just making a bet, right? You're making a bet to say, based on this expert's views, your future will rely on this. But that bet is not always right. But nobody then goes back to say, well, you did not prescribe that well for me. Think about K-12 education. Practically, we have really failed. I mean, Chris, you've been arguing for education change, God, for decades, and we've always been arguing, but they have not really truly made massive changes. But now we have come to a time, speaking of zeitgeist, I was just wondering, any of you, what are you thinking about? What AI, what generative AI can do. Another thing we know is that they're not, I just wrote an article, actually was accepted by the education leadership. I said, there are too many experts and too little expertise. Suddenly everybody is an AI expert. I mean, how many you have, right? Anywhere you go, you suddenly get so many experts. Everybody's writing about it. Everybody's presenting about it. Everybody's providing training. But we really do not know enough. I doubt, actually, if you look at the AI research that's shot up over the last 2 years, we really do not know a lot of things, but it's happening. So what I call the zeitgeist of the time, it's like Punya's talking about. We're going beyond and we're going behind and we're going forward. We don't know. There are many directions.
I can talk a little about ASU, but I'd love to hear what's happening, like Lydia, in your space with respect to this, and particularly, the areas that you have sort of brought us more people in around, like informal learning, and what's, if you have any insights into that, because that's not a space that I am fully engaged with, or Toronto University as well, right? University.
I think interestingly, just to like build on what Yong was speaking about, like we are running all these training programs and everyone's talking about AI. And in my recent experience in doing a professional development with teachers, like teacher want answers. And I told them, like, we need to like come up with these answers together, and we can't wait for these experts or to give us these specific guidelines. We need to engage in this ongoing dialogue to form these guidelines and negotiate and have this open discussion with our students. And I think it's really a shift from like I think in PD, like the expectation of like this good practices that we're going to incorporate and bring to our classroom, to like we need to be part of this solution. So I think there's a lot of still a lot of uncertainty in the education space. Teachers don't know what to do, and then at the same time they don't necessarily have the bandwidth to do all this kind of experimentation. And so it's an interesting space. I feel like the tension between giving some guidelines, but at the same time leaving the space open for this type emerging things to open from the real world. In terms of the informal learning space, interesting, like in the conference, I think this June in Washington, in the kind of like unconventional education space, AI wasn't really talked about. And I don't know, like it seems that I don't know whether that was just a conference that they didn't, there was no interest in this area. It wasn't really talked about. And I think what my takeaway from the conference was this like dissatisfaction towards this traditional model of education, and these like parents and community members from the ground up, they want to take education in their own hands. So we have all these different people from very diverse backgrounds, and we actually had 2 guests like in this past 6 episodes from Realm, which stands for Redesigning Education, Living Meaningfully. And I remember Jessica and Victoria, the 2 founders of this kind of unconventional learning space, were mothers. They find like there was no place they want to send their kids, and they decide to design a learning space that they will want to send their children. And that's how they started this innovation. So that's a really long answer to the questions, but that's my thoughts so far.
I think the biggest worry I have is there are so many companies pitching the same old tools. They're just adding AI to it, right? To the K-12 space. And essentially what it is an API to the OpenAI back end with like a prompt layer on it, right? There is no investigation of what those large language models, what their biases are. It's just is just this absolute, in the world that I'm living in, that I'm listening to, like just a blind acceptance of it being this amazing thing, and which is like incredibly scary and like just strange to me, you know.
There was some interesting information at this summit because we began with a session on communications. How should the AI institutes communicate to the world? And there was some data that I hadn't seen where there's all this hype about companies, but it turns out that less than 5% of companies are seriously using AI at this point, and the rest of them are wary. That's reassuring, actually. And they also did some surveys of the general public, and they said that the general public was much more concerned about AI and bad actors like deep fakes and scams than it was excited about good actors and positive uses of AI. So there's some common sense that's being applied here. And 3 years ago, everything was VR.
Right.
And 2 years ago, everything was the metaverse.
Don't forget
Which-
blockchain.
Yeah, don't forget blockchain. So Lydia's right. We have to be very careful about saying, oh, now we know what you need for the future. Just get your 1 year certification in Gen AI and prompt engineering, and you'll be set to go. That's it, the hype cycle is going to move on. And that said, though, the advance of large language models being able to respond to language is a more major leap, I think, than
Yeah, for sure.
practical VR or than the Mark Zuckerberg's vision of the metaverse. So we do need to acknowledge that, and the trick is to focus people on the legitimate things that these models can do as opposed to the hype.
So, have any of you tried Google's new Notebook LM? Okay, so what Notebook LM does, try this. You just have to go to look up Notebook LM. And I did this. You can take any PDF article that you have or a bunch of articles, just upload it and say, make a podcast. And it'll make a podcast with two guests talking. It's unfreaking canny. I have it on my website if you want to. So I took one of those articles that I'd written about ambigrams and mathematics and the relationship of symmetries and things like that, because I didn't want to do a net tech piece. And you have these two guests who talk to each other, and it does not sound computer generated. They will pause. They will search for a phrase. They'll be like, they'll speak like this, and they will interrupt each other. It is absolutely, I mean, it's uncanny. It feels very uncanny when you listen to it. But I can see how if somebody didn't know that this was AI generated, they would completely believe that it's a real thing, right? And right now you just have two voices, but that's because they haven't trained it on enough voices yet. That's coming next. You could train it on your voice. So our webinar might be just next year. We could have 4 bots do this conversation and we'd be good, right? But one of the things that what I was sort of writing in my blog post about it is that a lot of people are talking about like, oh, this is the next great thing for education. And I'm like, how is this the next great thing for education? Because part of learning is the churn, is the hard work, is the struggling with the ideas. If everything is going to become like a nugget of a 10-minute podcast episode, then why would anybody write the article in the first place? Because there is some value in that struggle, right? And I think that podcast is uncannily good, but it doesn't really get you to experience that relationship between mathematics and art that I'm trying to get at. And it's just been, but I really think it's worth a try just to get a sense of where the technology is that they're willing to release to us today. You see what I'm saying? Like just like Google Maps, the version that we get, we think, wow, this is allow us to get into like a 10 feet resolution from the sky. Now you think about what NSA has, where they can count the number of hairs on my head, which is a very difficult task even when you're standing close to me, right? And so if Google is willing to release this to the world, what is the technology that they have that they're still sort of tweaking before they throw out in the world? But I really recommend trying Notebook LLM just for the experience of it.
Yeah, I think Punya, my dean tried that. He tried, he and I co-wrote a book 2 years ago. He took one of the chapters and then they produced, again, like I said, an uncanny episode of a podcast. But actually, I'm really like interested in this because when Lydia was talking about guidelines, this committee we formed, we're trying to develop guidelines for AI. But the questions, right, like Punya, you mentioned this example, there's so many AI tools, AI-driven tools, and how do you produce even any guidelines for anybody? And that's just, it's almost impossible. I think Chris mentioned about 5% of companies using AI, the rest are worried about using AI. I think that's, coming back to our situation in schools, because there are a lot of people trying to create like a virtual Christine or virtual Lydia to do lectures. That's another big thing. But I have actually another question for you guys. There's another version of the AI-driven idea is the images. There's a lot of research. Remember, Punya, early in 80s, 90s, people use eye tracking to track people. Now that's become even more popular. I think we mentioned about this in early episodes. Versions like this before the large language models, they used to try to predict or try to make a judgment based on your breath rate, your eye tracking, whatever, and to say, are the students paying attention? So I'm very worried about this big prison-like judgment. I'm sure that's been used. In another version of that is companies or schools now using AI in hiring. They go through a lot of data, they read through your resume and to say if you are appropriate. So I just don't know, Christy, if you have any data about how widely are those being used in schools or in hiring processes?
I don't think anybody knows the data, in part because people that are using it are worried about getting sued, and so they're not necessarily being forthcoming about the fact that they're using it. What this conversation is reminding me of is that in the 90s, when I was doing keynotes, I used to use a short video clip called the 5-Minute University. I don't know if any of you remember this, but Father Guido Sarducci from Saturday Night Live had this little talk on, he was opening a 5-minute university, and in 5 minutes you could get what you would remember 5 years after you had your 4-year degree from a university. And the audience would howl because he'd say, economics, supply and demand. That's it. Theology, God is everywhere. Business, you buy something and you sell it for more. I mean, it was uncanny. 4 years of Spanish, and hasta la vista or something. I mean, it was uncanny, but it was also horrifying because, of course, it's true. And now everybody's so excited that they can get summaries. It'll boil an article down to 10 minutes of a podcast, or it'll give you a summary of a conversation that people had, a summary of an article, a summary of a video. It speaks to the low quality of education that the summary is seen as just as good and valid as what people are teaching. They're not evidently taking an article or an artifact of intellectual artifact of some kind and actually getting into all the depth and all the nuances and so on. It's like bing, 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 bing. Now we've covered those 5. No wonder people are satisfied with the equivalent of digital cliff notes. And that's going to continue to be the case until educators take it seriously, that it isn't that the devil is in the details, the knowledge is in the details. The information is the summary, but the knowledge is in the details.
That made me think that, all these education, like AI tools and like AI tools in general, they're built for efficiency. They want to do something fast and quick. But we know that's not how learning works. Sometimes you need to slow down. Like you don't, and again, I think it returns to the general impression of learning is this information acquisition, that learning is to remember something. That's what, if you can, yes, maybe if you, the things you can articulate verbally after 4 year of university is this amount, but all this implicit learning that you gained through these 4 years is invaluable. And so like, Chris, we recently did the PD on like, the different paradigm of learning, like learning as knowledge acquisition, learning as participation, learning as knowledge building. But like, I think we need to talk more about like learning as participation is not, and learning as knowledge building is not just like consume some information really quick and then you can pretend to be an expert. And this kind of quick expert mentality, I think is really concerning.
So first of all, thank you, Chris, for reminding me of that 5-minute university. I used to use that in my teaching, and I used to combine that with an article by Schulman, which was about what is learning, and he would talk about how in many places the level of recollection of what they had been taught in school was the same as the Ebbinghaus study of like nonsense syllables. So that's a really funny piece, and it's really good. And I think that's sort of the thing, which is like where we are thinking that learning is an easy task, and it's not. It is actually learning science or learning these things are actually quite complicated, hard work. And this urge to sort of simplify that, I think I want to underscore that. But I want to circle back to something, Chris, that you said, and I think Zhao, you sort of picked up on that. Not many companies are using it. I think that may be the wrong way of thinking about it, because companies by very nature are conservative, right? So if I have to go and base my financial modeling on a language model which can hallucinate even 0.01% of the time, it's putting me at high risk. I think the ones to talk to are the people in the company. And my sense is that the people in the company are using it at a much higher rate than they're willing to talk about. And I think that's true of teachers as well. I think that's true of students as well. I think there's a lot more usage of this happening without people feeling comfortable talking about it than an organization explicitly saying that, oh, we use large language models to do X, Y, or Z, screen candidates or do this or do that. So I think there's going to be a mismatch there between what people are publicly willing to say and companies that are saying that, yeah, we are using it to do our work.
Punya, what you're saying just now from our conversation sounds like the four of us are really like Luddites. We are against the use of AI. We talk about learning takes time. We talk about learning is not AI. We talk about, AI generated podcast is not good. It's actually kind of funny. And I remember the Father Satuch ended with Chris he said, "Do you have another minute? We're opening a law school next door." So that's
Yes.
So in a sense, it's actually it's a fascinating episode. I mean, a fascinating joke. But I think today, when we talk about learning is hard, we talk building knowledge is not easy. We talk about not necessarily memorizing this knowledge. Reminds me of a few years ago, I think it was a group of people from NYU. Didn't they conduct a study of American university students, they said they didn't learn anything. Remember that 4 years, that's practical what they predicted. So, why do you go to school? So it's, well, the report's idea was universities not doing a good job. But I think here comes to something we might want to think about. What do you actually learn? We talk about knowledge is cheap, but reasoning might be harder, whatever you call that reasoning, critical thinking, whatever, creativity, entrepreneur thinking, or how you use that knowledge. And maybe we forgot everything 5 years after 4 years of college. But what did we actually learn? Bonding in social relationships. I remember used to have studies comparing the cognitive achievement of students with a GED and a real high school diploma. And you can say, well, they passed the test. Cognitively or knowledge-wise, there may not be a big difference. But staying in high school for 2 extra years actually trains you a lot more in the social and emotional and aspect of it. I think we really probably have to rethink a lot about what does learning mean. We threw a lot of words around like innovation, creativity, curiosity, learning, but we never really pinned down to say, what does learning mean? Well, of course, it's psych, and that's the first message we send. What does learning mean? I think a lot of people trying to define that. I was just wondering, how we think about in the age of AI or in the year of AI, maybe next year we'll be doing something else. What does learning mean? I think we probably need to think about that.
So, Zhao, I don't want to come across as a Luddite because I use it every day. I'm using it right now to create the images for our, podcast series, right? What image should go with the AI thing. And what I have learned is that areas that I am good at, where I already developed filters at, I actually become even better at it. So I'm writing this thing about, for instance, I'm thinking of this blog post about uh, that, when we interact with media, this whole idea is that we suspend our disbelief. But I actually think that we actually believe. And in fact, what we need to be thinking about is suspension of belief. So I'm sort of now sitting with Claude and I was having a chat with it. And it said, oh, did you know that the suspension of disbelief first came from Samuel Taylor Coleridge in this essay? Okay. I'm like, oh, that's cool. I didn't know that. So now I go and look up Samuel Taylor Coleridge and I know him from the poem Kubla Khan. And so now I have another entry to write that blog post. But that comes from already having an understanding of the landscape. So when I'm creating images, I'm trying always very hard. I don't want it to look like the typical AI, a floating brain with things. Oh, I want it to look like an oil painting. I want it to look different. So I think what it does is that having expertise in a domain, this can actually be expertise plus. The challenge is that if you're not already know the ins and outs of what a good piece of writing is, you're going to take the blah blah rubbish that AI will throw at you as a first draft and say, okay, this is what a college essay should look like. I think that's the tension there. So I think this is an incredibly powerful tool if we think about it the right way. And I think sometimes, like most times in educational spaces, it's like, oh, I need to create a lesson plan. I'm just going to throw, these are the state requirements. This is this, give me a lesson plan. And I'm just going to take it whole cloth and then use it, right? As opposed to, I'm going to see it as the beginning of a thought process, which will allow me to think better. And, I think that's the tension here to me is that learning part. That's why it's not a great learning tool. I think it's a great sort of, and I think, Chris, you've always talked about it as augmenting intelligence instead of AI as being, intelligence augmentation. And I think that's the way to really, that's a powerful way of thinking about it.
Well, absolutely. I think, I think Punya, this is actually very interesting. If you think about your kindergartner or middle school or high school students, when you try to use them, if you cannot make good judgment, it's not very useful for you. And so you have to make the judgment. And if you can make the judgment, it makes your work much better. And like when we do research, I was actually trying to do some research about Seymour Saracen. I was really interested about why educations, don't change, why all reforms will fail. And there's, we talk about hallucination, there's misinformation, there's something. But what I think I'm interested in, I think this is the important conjecture for elementary school and high school, whatever, K-12 schools for teachers to think about is precisely what you were talking about. How much knowledge does a student have, or I would say judgment, and then what the AI can do, and can AI push? Does AI just give you, that suspension of disbelief? Is that information only useful to you? Can students learn from that? Because you've expanded your thinking a lot. So I think, in our schools, I have not seen a lot of research go into that field to say, does AI expand? Because you and I, Punya, we think alike. We love to see new things, and that can guide us to new places, and new possibilities are always interesting. But is that interesting for all students in learning? Because traditional schools, we limit the amount of information, and we try to train them to say what we're teaching you is important. So that's what I think that the point will lie.
Love to hear Lydia and Chris's thoughts on this.
Well, I think assessment is a sweet spot that people are thinking about in the wrong way. So I see people saying, "Oh, look, you can generate all these quizzes with AI." It's essentially a faster way of doing the wrong thing when you frame it that way. But you can now, because of the natural language processing capabilities, elicit performances from students and then provide feedback on the performances. Now, not all that feedback can be AI. Some of it, the AI isn't capable of providing, and a human being is going to need to provide. But active practice of skills that you're claiming that you have is really important. And this is opening up ways, including, reliable and valid ways of looking at somebody's claim that they can negotiate, or they can think critically, or they can resolve conflicts, and putting them to the test in a way that you can't do with a psychometric test. So some of it is just that, as usual, we're focusing on doing things better rather than doing better things. And getting the field off of that is very difficult to do.
I want to echo the harm that can be done when we do the wrong things much faster at a larger scale, without thinking about what are the better things to do here. But I also want to return to the idea of judgment. Actually, Chris and I have been talking about this a lot, and thinking about to write an article about this. Is like this this notion of expertise you just mentioned, Punya, like you have a deep expertise in writing, so you can effectively partner with AI to, augment your writing. But that's not the case in the learning context. The kids don't have that expertise. That's why, I feel like there's a need to tease apart, working in the context and learning context. And I think as a teacher, we have to ask ourselves, how much judgment do my children have in the face of this task? But I feel like until they've done the hard work and heavy lifting of doing these tasks themselves, they're not going to develop judgment. And I think that is what we meant by learning is hard, because it took us years to get where we are, and we didn't write a quick article generated by AI and develop this judgment. And so I think that's what we meant by learning is hard. And I think this also kind of tied up to the literature and expertise. They show that the novice, recognize superficial features when comparing different work, as opposed to the structural differences and the patterns. But this takes time to develop. And one thing a teacher shared with me what she did in the class, I thought that was a really interesting example, is that before she asked her children to write before she asked the AI to write the essay, she asked the students, you're going to write this essay yourself first, and then you're going to use a prompt to generate an essay by AI. Then you're going to compare and contrast this to essays and give us your thoughts. What's really interesting that after the student done the hard work of writing the essay themselves, they were super critical about what the AI has generated. They were like, oh, the AI didn't cover this. The AI didn't consider this. I didn't like the style here. It didn't flow. Like they were critiquing all aspects, like the quality of the writing as well as, the more grammar and flow piece of the writing. And I feel like maybe that's what we need to do with students, is that have them to do the hard work first, and then look at what AI does, and then over time to form that kind of judgment, so they are they can effectively partner with AI, not to give their agency away to AI.
Well, part of the challenge that's going to be, Lydia, is that we are speaking about the worst version of AI we will ever see in our lifetime. You see what I'm saying? I mean, if you just look at the output of LLM, like Open Chat GPT 2.0, 3, 3, 5, 4, that's in just the past 2 years. I mean, I don't know how long that growth will continue. There are people who argue that as we run out of training data and synthetic data, all of that kind of stuff, it might not. I don't know that, but I do know that these systems will get better. We will figure out better ways of extracting. And so I think that's going to be part of the challenge, is that it'll reach a point where you can say, I am a 6th grader. This is my background. Here is an essay I wrote before. Now write me an essay on this topic, which mimics my voice and makes it sound with enough spelling errors and things thrown in that it looks like it was written by me. And it will do it. I mean, that's not, and there will be kids who are figuring that out, that's how you use the system. I mean, I think that's sort of the tension here, which is, I think, goes back to this point that Zhao was making, that we are trying to make these guidelines where we don't know what is, it's like trying to draw the continents while the continents are all shifting. You say this is Asia, like, no, this is now part of South America, because that chunk floated away and got attached over there. That's, I think, the situation we are in right now.
That actually gets to another topic. I think with the Open University we had, one of the things, Lydia, when we talk about learning, actually all of us, we are imagining an idealized learning environment and context for all students, which is not true, which is absolutely not true. That's our problem, right? We've been talking a lot about education equity. So, I'm reimagining about students in parts of China, where I'm from, villages. But now with AI, they suddenly have access to run a broad range of whatever. There's, of course, dangerous. There's, we talk about hallucination, we talk about bias, but suddenly they have access to this world of knowledge summarized to them. We don't know how good or how bad they are. It definitely beats a lot of us in terms of understanding of knowledge, and definitely beats all the teachers they have in those places. So how does the students, I'm sure it's kind of iterative and two-way street, that you interact with it, you're affected by it, and then at the same time you affect it. I mean, it's a very interesting process. I'm just saying that, how does this help or hurt people from different context, learning context? And another thing, we're always imagining learning as a rational, reasonable, systemic process, which is not true. I mean, all of us here, if we think about our life, all of us, I mean, I would even include Chris here, we never had the perfect education in our own way. We learned to manage our own learning, to develop that ability. And luckily, during the process, we might have run into a mentor, a tutor, a teacher, or someone who helped us rethink about this process. So I was wondering, again, how artificial intelligence introduces new concepts, new possibilities. The week ago, we did the Open University, which is really, to me, imagine Open University sends in early days, experimental materials to a village. That is new information, and people were surprised and shocked, and some people learned from it, and some people didn't. So I'm just thinking about how AI broadens the access, but what good and what bad would be. I think Punya is right. None of us are really truly Luddites. But at the same time, we might be too old to be too cautious, and there are a lot of people using it for whatever they want to do. I mean, again, leaders speak of that. Does the student become more critical of AI? Do they write better than AI? I don't know. Actually, I'm not sure if that's true. But you could. So I think another issue I just want to throw out here is no matter what we talk about, the 4 of us or the 5 of us, it's happening like a social movement, and people have access to it in their own ways. And education practically failed to teach kids to deal with Google. Education failed to teach kids deal with social media. Education has failed to teach kids deal with anything, actually. So now with AI, I doubt we can do anything to do that. The 3 or 4 of us having a good conversation on Saturday, but if we had any influence, how would Rennie throw out? Because this whole idea, learning sciences have come up with some ideas, about how learning happens, but I bet that captures probably part of the population. And learning sciences, their experimental sites might be different from other places. So anyway, that's just a bunch of random thoughts.
This reminds me of I think it was Ethan Mollick who said that, use AI, think about the best expert that's available to you, and whether that's better than the AI you have, and if not, then you can try using AI and see what it does. And I definitely agree that this the possibility of access the AI is creating for the mass. But I think the problem here is the AI we currently have, they're not built for learning, or they're not designed for education. So I think the problem here is not we're against AI, actually. I don't think that's the case, but it's that we need to create better AI for education. And I think that's illustrated by the past 2 episodes by the National AI Institute. I think they're doing good work doing fundamental research to also to not just thinking about the application of the existing system, but building better systems.
One of the things, Punya, that I think is going to influence the evolution of AI is small language models, because the reason you need a large language model is if you're going to have unrestricted human speech from anywhere in the world, then you need a huge training set so that it can find patterns in that. But in many, many educational situations, the range of vocabulary that's going to be used is much smaller. The range of ideas that are going to be conveyed is much smaller. And the small language models are easier to construct, they're easier to train, they are less expensive to maintain. So that's one kind of evolution. Another speaker talked about a vision in the AI community, which is to combine cognitive AI, kind of classic AI, and Gen AI, which is like neural net AI, together, so that they kind of cancel out each other's weaknesses and build off each other's strengths. It's a lot easier to say than it is to do, of course, but as things improve, that's a frontier that could get past some of the limits of large language models that are structural limits that are not going to go away no matter how much. Structure doesn't go away no matter how much money you throw at something, but changing the structure may lead to positive things. Young, I agree with what you're saying about, you know, the democratization of knowledge, but I think we have to be careful about what the knowledge is because, you know, with the search engine, you get multiple sources and you have to decide which source or sources are the best for your purposes, and you get exposed to different points of view about the same thing, and you have to decide what you want to do about that. Gen AI says, here's what you want. It doesn't show you the menu, it doesn't give you a choice. I would argue that Gen AI right now is probably very Western in its perspective because that's what most of the World Wide Web is. It's Western generated material. And so there could, along with the democratization of knowledge, there could be a homogenization of conclusions that are drawn from knowledge that I think would be a loss. So it's complicated.
You know, Chris, I think you're absolutely right. Even the Chinese large language models, the back end is still Western. They added a
Seriously.
front end to control it. And I was
Oh,
playing with that. I was asking, I said, give me some examples of, what can students do in project-based learning, And then I said, okay, that's Western. Can you give me some specific Chinese examples? And they basically used Western view of Chinese students. Too much academic work, too much academic. So how the students can design something to reduce the academic burden on it. It was really interesting.
that
And,
is fascinating.
no, you just asked me, So there is a Western view of Chinese students, and then Punya, they can drive some new questions based on that view. You can say, but Chinese
So
kids may
this
not
is
be.
really funny because I wrote a blog post the other day. This is like a few weeks ago called and this is based on the marshmallows test, the marshmallow test where they put a marshmallow in front of a kid. You have to look at the blog post not to read it but for the image that I generated for it. It's one of my favorite images, so go to my website and look up marshmallow and you'll find that image. It's that's why I love AI. Sometimes it let me create something which was super funny, cute, but appropriate to the task. But anyway, so this was building on a story in the Washington Post that the marshmallow test has now been used across the globe as a way of measuring students' sort of ability to self-control and so on, and that is a measure of how they will succeed in life later. Turns out that it is very culturally biased, that in some contexts that marshmallow test actually doesn't work. And so what I talked about was these large language models, but are actually trained on masses of data and stories in the Washington Post and Scientific American and what have you, journal articles, which talk about the marshmallow test as being really, really true. And there are just very few data points about the opposing point. And so what will happen now is that as you use the marshmallow test in cultural context where it is actually not appropriate, students who don't demonstrate what is a very Western idea are going to be regarded as being requiring intervention while actually they are doing just fine. So I think it's called s'mores and something about the flattening of culture, which is exactly the point, Zhao, that you're making, which is why I found that Chinese example quite hilarious. I'll dig it out and I'll share the link. If for nothing
Well,
else, just
Lydia
see the
just shared
image.
that link.
I will
But it
drop it
actually
right now.
is, well, yeah, that's very much like a chocolate experiment, right? I mean, the chocolate experiment used to be regarded as the classic psychology study, but it's really has a lot to do with the kid's background. It's really. But there's another example. In the day before yesterday, I wrote a little article. I asked ChatGPT, I said, give me a score, 1 out of 10. So give me, so yeah, it's a B plus. It's pretty good article, blah, blah, blah. So I want to get my scores higher. I said, what if this was written by a non-native speaker of English? Oh, so this is a 9.5 out of 10. Was really interesting. I'm just trying to play with what it can do.
Oh, so we've actually done a bunch of studies where we don't just ask it for a one shot. We run the same set of prompts like 50 times, 100 times with slight nuance changes in the prompts, because then you can do a statistical analysis on it because these are generative. So every time it gives you an answer, it gives you a slightly different answer. And so you can actually run like psychological experiments on it. And what we have found is that just the change of one word in a student written essay changes the scores that these LLMs gives, changes the level of feedback that it provides and stuff like that. So it's super fast. Chris, I think I interrupted you. I'm sorry.
No, not at all. Not at all. I'm not an expert in Chinese proverbs, but the story about the Western back end reminds me of one Chinese proverb I do know, which is that one drop of mouse poop spoils the whole bowl of soup.
Well, Chris, speaking of Chinese proverbs, I used to joke about it. I said, everything in the world you can attribute to either Confucius or Einstein. And I mean, you can never be wrong. You can just say Einstein said and Confucius said this. But I would say, Rennie, I think, today we focus a lot on AI. And again, what I worry about is schools. Schools have all kinds of reasons to use it and not use it. But really, most people who use it are not familiar with it. I'm not familiar with it. What Chris was said is really interesting about like search engines. Search engines, you go to the source. That's different than generative AI creates, because this pretends to be an expert. And if you do not know what it does, if you don't play with it, it's very, very challenging. When we have a conversation, we know each other's background. We know, like Chris or Punya, Lydia, you're trustworthy. I don't have to go check on you. I don't say, okay, what did Chris say? Generally, I would believe something. But with AI, with young people, with teachers, how do you know? I mean, how do you know what you don't know? And when you go back to a very philosophical question, how do you know what you don't know? And how do you know when Punya said, I can judge it, but how can you judge it? And how do you know your judgment is wrong? You're like, again, I mean, think about in my village, the kids there. If you put South America on top of Africa, they wouldn't know the difference. I mean, if you can prop a little island into Mediterranean, they say, oh, okay. And maybe it doesn't even matter to them, right? In their lifelong, maybe where is South America doesn't really matter if, it's somewhere there. I'm just really thinking a lot of these things needs to be played out and thought about.
Anyway, I just put a couple of links in there. The other one is one of my latest posts about, again, exactly this issue of trust and how we form these parasocial relationships. And that can really undermine, and there's this whole thing of deep fakes that is 1 in 8 kids, I think, now has some experience of somebody who has created a deep fake sort of a sex video or something of somebody that they know. I mean, we are living in a very, very strange world today where truth, and I mean, you just have to look at the misinformation around the hurricanes and the storms that just happened, right? And so it is, that's where I think the foundational question of what we believe to be true and on what basis we believe it, I think is really up for grabs right now. So anyway, I think we are close to the hour. So Chris, do you want to introduce the next episode?
Yes, we are working our way through the 5 national AI institutes that the National Science Foundation has funded. We had 2 in September, and next Saturday, the 19th, we will have the 3rd, Engage AI, which is about culturally relevant narratives. So we know that storytelling is very powerful in learning and motivation. But when you're telling a story to an intensely multicultural classroom, you have to be careful about how to navigate through how different cultures are going to interpret parts of that story. And this very ambitious institute is looking at ways that Gen AI may be able to help with that. So I hope that you will listen in either during the episode or pull up the video afterwards, because I think it's going to be fascinating. Looking forward to seeing you then.